Today I'm going to show you the family tree of the ancient Israelite kings. I'll be starting with the kings of the legendary United Monarchy, which include David and Solomon, and then I'll be going through both the kings of Israel in the north and the kings of Judah in the south. Many of these later kings are known to be historical, so along the way I'll be pointing out some of the archaeological evidence that we have for their existence. This video is part of my series on biblical genealogy, so if you haven't yet watched the earlier parts and want to do that first, you can find a link to those in the description. So the most famous king of ancient Israel is King David. On this chart, I've used Michelangelo's statue of him. But David was not the first king of Israel. The first king was actually a man named Saul. Prior to Saul, the 12 tribes of Israel were said to have been ruled by a series of judges, who were basically temporary leaders who led armies during times of crisis. But according to the Bible, the people eventually got tired of that system and demanded to have a king. So they drew lots, and in the end, Saul from the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. This marked the beginning of what's referred to as the United Monarchy, which means that all 12 tribes of Israel were united under a single king. Now, as I mentioned in part 1, there is no evidence outside of the Bible that a united Israelite kingdom ever actually existed. When we look at the archaeological record for this time period, what we find is a bunch of small Israelite villages with seemingly no centralized government. This greatly contrasts with the biblical description of the period, which paints Israel as being a large, powerful, and extremely wealthy nation. So the most likely conclusion is that these first few kings are more legendary than historical. This means that they likely did exist, but were perhaps more akin to local tribal chieftains than mighty kings, and that the Bible exaggerates their power. With that said, let's continue the story. During Saul's reign, a young hero named David from the tribe of Judah starts to grow in popularity after an incident in which David was able to kill an enemy giant named Goliath. After that event, David joins Saul's army, becomes best friends with Saul's eldest son Jonathan, and even marries one of Saul's daughters, named Michal. He then goes on to be very successful in several battles against the Israelites' main enemy, the Philistines. Eventually, Saul becomes jealous of David and tries to have him killed, forcing David to go into hiding. Then, both Saul and Jonathan die in a battle against the Philistines. At this point, the tribe of Judah declares David to be their king, but the rest of the tribes choose Saul's only remaining son, Ishbosheth. There's a 7-year civil war between the two sides, and eventually Abner, who was Saul's main general, as well as his first cousin, switches sides and supports David. Soon thereafter, Ishbosheth is killed by his own men, and David becomes king of all Israel. He makes Jerusalem his capital, and in total he reigns 40 years. So let's now look at David's tree in more detail. David was the youngest son of a man named Jesse, who in turn was the son of Obed. And Obed was the son of Boaz and Ruth, the two main characters from the book of Ruth. So basically, Ruth was David's great-grandmother. I'd also like to point out David's nephew Joab, who was the son of one of his sisters. He becomes David's main general and features quite prominently in the story of David's life. Oh, and remember David's best friend Jonathan? Well, Jonathan had a disabled son named Mephibosheth, who David adopts after he becomes king. Now, I've already mentioned that David married one of Saul's daughters, but he also married 7 other women and had at least 18 children. His firstborn son and heir was named Amnon. But there's a story in the Bible in which Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, who was the full sister of Absalom. Absalom seeks revenge and has Amnon killed. Later, Absalom instigates a coup against his father David and tries to take the throne. But following a battle, Absalom gets his long, beautiful hair stuck in the branches of a tree. Joab finds Absalom and, disobeying David's orders to take him alive, kills him, for which Joab ends up losing his job. Another famous story associated with David is the story of David and Bathsheba, in which David sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop and conspires to have her husband killed in battle so that he could marry her. So, yeah, as literary figures go, David is a pretty complicated character. He does a lot of good things, but he also does a bunch of bad things too. But generally, he's seen as a good guy because he always seems to repent and learn from his mistakes. Anyway, he has a son with Bathsheba named Solomon, and it is Solomon that ends up becoming the next king. Now, there's two other sons of David shown on the chart. I include Adonijah because when David dies, there's a failed attempt by him to take the throne. And I show Nathan because according to the Gospel of Luke, it is through Nathan that Jesus links back to David. I'll be doing a separate video on the genealogies of Jesus, so keep an eye out for that. Okay, so Solomon is mostly remembered as being the one who builds the first temple, as well as for being really wise, really rich, and for supposedly having 1,000 wives. One of his wives was possibly the Queen of Sheba. She's mentioned only briefly in the Bible, but in Ethiopian tradition, the story is told in more detail. There, she is said to have had a son named Menelik, who becomes the king of Ethiopia and the progenitor of the Solomonic dynasty. If you're interested to learn more about that line, I've got a separate video on that topic, which I'll link to in the description. So, like his father David, Solomon reigns for a total of 40 years. The fact that both these kings have nice, round, very symbolic reign lengths is further evidence that they are likely legendary figures, as opposed to strictly historical ones. So, after the reign of Solomon, the kingdom splits in two. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south continue to be ruled by the house of David in Jerusalem and are known as the Kingdom of Judah, whereas in the north, the 10 remaining tribes declare independence and become known as the Kingdom of Israel. Their first king is a man named Jehoshaphat, who was from the tribe of Ephraim, which was the largest of the 12 tribes. Let's look at the Kingdom of Israel first, and then we'll go back and look at the Kingdom of Judah second. So in Israel, we get several ruling dynasties. Jeroboam is followed by his son Nadab, but 2 years into his reign, Nadab is killed by one of his army captains named Baasha, and Baasha becomes king instead. Baasha was from the tribe of Issachar. But then history repeats itself. He has a decently long reign and passes things on to his son Elah, but then after just 2 years, Elah is assassinated by one of his army commanders, a man named Zimri. But Zimri is unable to hold on to power and commits suicide after just 7 days as king. At this point, there's a civil war. Some of the people support Tibni, who was probably a relative of Zimri, but others support Omri, who was likely from the tribe of Issachar, like Baasha and Elah. Eventually, Omri's side wins, and he becomes the sole king. Now, Omri is a very important figure. Strangely, unlike many other Bible characters, his name is not well known today. However, in my opinion, he was one of the most important kings in ancient Israel. He holds the distinction of being the earliest known person in the entire Bible, for which we have evidence in the archaeological record. So you'll notice that he has a red check mark next to his name, kind of like the verification symbols you see on social media. On this chart, whenever you see a red check mark, it means that we have a source outside of the Bible that confirms the existence of that person in real life. So let's talk quickly about how we know Omri was a real historical king. If you're ever in Paris, you can check out the following artifact at the Louvre. It's called the Mesha stele and comes from the ancient kingdom of Moab, which today would be part of Jordan. It dates to just a few decades after the reign of Omri and describes Omri, king of Israel, capturing some Moabite territory. The name Omri shows up on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which is now housed at the British Museum in London. I'll be talking about this artifact more in a bit, but for now, note that it clearly mentions the phrase House of Omri, indicating that other nations at the time knew that the kingdom of Israel was being ruled by a dynasty that started with Omri. Omri is also important because he founded the city of Samaria, which went on to be the capital of the northern kingdom for the rest of its existence. Anyway, Omri was followed by his son Ahab, and the Bible talks a lot more about him and also about his wife, Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel were the king and queen of Israel at the time that the prophet Elijah lived, Elijah being one of the more famous prophets in Jewish history. The Bible paints Ahab as being a very wicked king, influenced strongly by his wife Jezebel, who was a Phoenician and thus not an Israelite. From a literary point of view, Jezebel is an interesting figure because in most cases she is portrayed as the ultimate evil seductress. But on the other hand, those who see the evil seductress trope as being a dangerous stereotype and an attempt to discredit strong, confident women, Jezebel has actually become somewhat of a feminist icon. Anyway, we do not have any corroborating evidence for the existence of Jezebel. But we do have mention of her father and brother in a now lost history of Tyre that was quoted by Josephus. Her brother, Baal-Esser II, was supposedly the grandfather of the legendary queen Dido, who is said to have founded the city of Carthage. So that's an interesting link there. One thing to keep in mind about the biblical account of the Northern Kingdom is that it was primarily written and edited much later by scribes from the Southern Kingdom. So there's an obvious bias toward the monotheistic religion that developed at Jerusalem and that went on to evolve into what's called Second Temple Judaism, which in turn led to the development of the better known Rabbinical Judaism, as well as Christianity and Islam. So basically, from the Southern Kingdom's perspective, the Northern Kingdom was seen as being disobedient to the one true God, Hashem. Ahab and Jezebel were famous for promoting the worship of the god Baal instead. So whenever something went wrong, the Southerners blamed it on the fact that the Northerners worshipped the wrong god or gods. Ahab has a red checkmark because he shows up in a set of Assyrian monuments, known as the Kirk monoliths, currently located at the British Museum. In those inscriptions, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III claims that he defeated 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite. According to the Bible, he's killed during a war with the kingdom of Judah and is followed by his sons Ahaziah and Jehoram. Jehoram's name appears on an artifact known as the Tel Dan Stele, which was discovered in the 1990s and currently is housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. That inscription confirms a story told in the Bible in which Jehoram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, are defeated by Hazael, king of Aram Damascus. I'll talk more about the Tel Dan Stele when we talk about Judah, but in the Bible's version, a man named Jehu ends up replacing Jehoram as king of Israel. It's at this point that Jezebel is killed by being pushed out of a window. Although the Bible doesn't make it clear, it's possible that Jehu was a descendant of Omri through a junior branch. In fact, his name appears on the black obelisk of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, where he is described as Jehu, son of Omri, most likely meaning Jehu from the house of Omri. But the black obelisk is even more important because it actually includes an image of Jehu, bowing down and giving gifts to Shalmaneser. This is the first and only contemporary image we have of an ancient Israelite king. Things seem to have stabilized at this point because after Jehu's reign, we get a series of 4 father-son successions. I'll point out Jehoash because his name appears in the archaeological record as well. He is mentioned in the stele of Adad-Nirari III, now located in Baghdad at the Iraq Museum. There, he is referred to as the king of Samaria, which is the earliest reference we have outside of the Bible of that particular city. We don't have any direct evidence outside of the Bible for a king named Jeroboam II. However, in one verse, it describes an earthquake that occurred during Jeroboam II's reign. And according to the geological record, we know that there was indeed a big earthquake in the region around 760 BCE, which fits. So following Jeroboam II, things start to go downhill. His son Zechariah is assassinated in his first year and replaced with an army commander, who in turn is assassinated after just 1 month and replaced with another army commander named Menahem. Menahem is mentioned in the annals of Tiglath-Pileser III as being one of the many kings who paid him tribute. He was eventually followed by his son Pekahiah, who, like so many Israelite kings, was eventually assassinated and replaced with one of his army commanders. That king, named Pekah, is also mentioned in Assyrian records as paying tribute to Tiglath-Pileser. And guess what happened to Pekah? Yep, he was assassinated and replaced by one of his army commanders. This fact is confirmed in Assyrian records. That king, named Hoshea, would be the last king of Israel. He made a deal with Egypt in the hopes of avoiding paying tribute to Assyria. That was a bad move because Assyria, now led by Shalmaneser V, responded by conquering the kingdom for good and destroying their capital at Samaria. So over here I've been pointing out several of the Assyrian kings. Unlike the ancient Israelite kings, the existence of all of them can be confirmed by the archaeological record. So instead of giving them all a red check mark, what I've done instead is give the ones that are mentioned by name in the Bible a little blue check mark. So that's what those symbols mean. Okay, let's now look at the southern kingdom of Judah. There, King Solomon was followed by his son Rehoboam, whose mother was a non-Israelite named Naamah. She came from the nearby kingdom of Ammon, now located in Jordan. And interestingly, Rehoboam married a granddaughter of Absalom. So in a way, Absalom's line did end up on the throne in the end. He was followed by their son Abijah, and then by Asa, who had a long and peaceful reign. Generally, the Bible describes the kings of Judah as being good kings, who destroyed idols and encouraged the worship of the one true God, in contrast with the kings of Israel, who did the opposite, and were therefore punished with more internal conflict. Next in line in Judah comes Jehoshaphat, who was a contemporary with Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel. In fact, his son Jehoram married a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Together, that couple had Ahaziah, who, as I mentioned earlier, allied with his uncle, King Jehoram of Israel, against the king of Aram Damascus. Which brings me back to the Tel Dan Stele, which describes the incident. In that inscription, it appears to read, Amaziah, son of Jehoram, of the house of David. This is important because it is the earliest reference in the archaeological record to the house of David. But note that it doesn't directly reference David as king, nor does it describe anything that David did. Instead, it simply references the existence of a royal dynasty named after someone called David. This is a bit different from the reference to the house of Omri, being that Omri lived just a few decades before the earliest mention of his name, whereas David lived over 100 years before the earliest mention of his name. This is why David is still considered to be more of a legendary figure, whereas Omri is considered more of a historical figure. Anyhow, Ahaziah died following the conflict with Aram Damascus. At this point, his mother, Queen Athaliah, became the ruling monarch, the only monarch of the kingdom of Judah that was a female, and the only one that did not belong to the paternal line of David. Remember, she was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. She proceeded to kill all the possible claimants to the throne of Judah, but she missed one because, unbeknownst to her, a relative smuggled away and hid one of Ahaziah's sons, who was just a baby at the time. When that child, named Joash, was 7, he was revealed, and with the help of the priests, he was made king, thus reestablishing the line of David. He would be the first of 2 child kings who feature prominently in the biblical story of ancient Israel. He was followed by Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, most of whom are attested to somehow in the archaeological record. For example, a royal seal has been found belonging to Ahaz, son of Jotham, thus confirming the names of these 2 kings. Hezekiah is generally considered to be one of the greatest kings in the history of ancient Israel. He reigned shortly after the fall of the northern kingdom, and he used the opportunity to reorganize and strengthen the kingdom of Judah. Prior to this, the kingdom of Israel was by far the larger and more important of the 2 kingdoms. This is why the idea of a united monarchy, ruled by a southern dynasty, the House of David, is most likely just a legend that was created later in order to make Judah seem more important. Either way, it was definitely at this point that the kingdom of Judah did become larger and more important. One can imagine that there were likely lots of refugees streaming down from the ruins of the northern cities, and that this led to a population boom in the southern cities. There is certainly a lot of archaeological findings from this period, both from Assyrian records as well as from evidence found in Jerusalem. For example, we know that Hezekiah rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem in preparation for an Assyrian attack. Remnants of these walls can still be seen today. It is also thought that he is the one who ordered the construction of the Siloam Tunnel, another feature in Jerusalem that still exists today. The Bible also mentions two major historical figures who existed at the same time as Hezekiah: Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and Taharka, king of Cush, who was also a pharaoh of Egypt. It was during the reign of Hezekiah that the prophet Isaiah lived, the first of the four so-called major prophets. It is thought that Isaiah was probably a grandson of King Josiah, and thus a member of the royal family. It is also possible that he was Hezekiah's father-in-law. However, the most important thing to mention about Hezekiah is that the Assyrians did in fact attack the kingdom of Judah during his reign, which was a logical next step after having destroyed the kingdom of Israel. However, Hezekiah was able to hold them off, and thus Judah survived and went on to become the main power in the Levant over the next century. He was followed by his son Manasseh, who is also mentioned in Assyrian records, and then by Ahaz, who was assassinated after just 2 years on the throne. This led to an 8-year-old boy named Josiah becoming king. Although Josiah is not nearly as famous as Kings David and Solomon, I would actually argue that he was much more important, for it was Josiah who laid the foundation for what became Second Temple Judaism, which in turn, as I mentioned earlier, was the religion from which Rabbinical Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all stemmed from. Biblical scholars have concluded that it was during the reign of Josiah that the original parts of the book of Deuteronomy were written, and some scholars even believe that this core part of Deuteronomy was actually the earliest part of the Bible to be written. One theory is that the story of Joshua's conquest of Canaan was invented in order to inspire the people living during Josiah's time to conquer the lands to the north that had recently been laid waste by the Assyrians, and that the story of the united monarchy was invented in order to legitimize the House of David's rule over the entire land of Israel. Whether or not this is true, we do know for certain that Josiah did try to conquer the northern areas during his reign. But unfortunately, he failed, and in fact, he died in the process. According to the Bible, he was killed by a pharaoh named Necho, who we know from Egyptian records was in fact a historical pharaoh that had just recently come to power at that exact time. After the death of Josiah, Judah started to decline rapidly. 3 of his sons and 1 of his grandsons followed him as king, and it was his third son, Zedekiah, who would be the final king of Judah. By this point, the Babylonians had conquered Assyria and were now the major power in the Middle East. Their famous king, Nebuchadnezzar, defeated the kingdom of Judah and destroyed Jerusalem, along with its temple, in 586 BCE. At this point, most of the Jews were transported to Babylon, where they then lived in exile. The second and third of the 4 major prophets are Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They both lived during the final days of Judah and during the early part of the exile. Jeremiah was the son of the high priest Hilkiah, who served during the reign of King Josiah. The 4th and final major prophet is Daniel. He is thought to be a literary invention, not a historical figure. According to most scholars, the book of Daniel was the last book of the Hebrew Bible to be written, and is usually dated to the Maccabean period. However, the story places Daniel and his 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as members of the Jewish royal family, living in exile in Babylon, and later Persia. Although the reign of the House of David officially came to an end in 586 BCE, there was a position known as the Exilarch that survived much longer. The exilarch was basically the leader of the Jewish community in Babylon. Early exilarchs include Jeconiah's son Shealtiel and grandson Zerubbabel. The genealogy given in the Gospel of Matthew traces the line leading to Jesus back to Zerubbabel. Information on the exilarchs after Zerubbabel and their exact genealogy is pretty sketchy. However, they are mentioned on and off in historical records all the way up to the year 1258 CE, which is when Baghdad fell to the grandson of Genghis Khan. Another title that has been used throughout Jewish history, both in the Levant and in the European diaspora, is Nasi, which means prince. Whether or not certain individuals who used the name Nasi, or anyone else for that matter, are direct male line descendants of the House of David is something that cannot really be proved one way or another. There are lots of fanciful theories that try to connect various dynasties back to the Davidic line, such as the Merovingians, but none of these are taken seriously by historians. So that was a look at the kings of ancient Israel and Judah. Be sure to check out the links in the description for the other videos in this series on biblical genealogy. If you're enjoying this series, another series you might like is The Jewish Story Explained, produced by the YouTube channel Unpacked. I highly recommend it, and I'll put a link to that series in the description. Be sure to check it out. Thanks for watching.